Welcome to the Arms Control Primer, a podcast by the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I am your host, Alex Bollfrass, the head of strategy, technology, and arms control, based in Berlin. On each episode, we welcome the world's leading experts in arms control to share their knowledge and assessments on the most critical issues. Whether you are new to the topic or need a refresher, please join us in our exploration of the nuclear past, present, and future. In this season, we examine the histories and policies of countries that may have had nuclear weapons ambitions or even nuclear arsenals, and gave them up. We search for lessons for non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament. I hope it helps you better know a non-nuke.
The program was secret in the initial years, which means that the public didn't know about it. But in 1954, the Supreme Commander proposed publicly that Sweden should acquire technical nuclear weapons, and this started a very intense debate. It has been described as the most intense security policy debate of the century in Sweden.
This new situation, and especially so when Finland started to argue that they need to join NATO, that changed the whole situation in Sweden as well. And in terms of nuclear weapons, it became a very sensitive issue when the membership of NATO became an issue in the Swedish political debate. Nuclear weapons became a very sensitive topic.
During the early Cold War, several European countries pursued nuclear weapons ambitions to deter the Soviet Union. Sweden, later known for neutrality and disarmament advocacy, was among them. This episode examines how Sweden decided to forego nuclear arms in the 1960s and considers how the war in Ukraine has reshaped Sweden's current stance on nuclear weapons. Joining the discussion are Dr. Emma Rosengren and Dr. Thomas Jonter.
My name is Emma Rosengren, and I'm a researcher at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs and at Stockholm University. Sweden's nuclear weapons ambition started already in the 1940s, so right after the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The Supreme Commander in Sweden is the highest ranked military officer. He requested the Swedish Defense Agency to make a study on what was called the atomic bomb at the time in Sweden. And in 1948, the military leadership commissioned the same agency, the Swedish Defense Research Agency, to investigate if it would be possible for Sweden to actually manufacture atomic bombs. And the plan was to place this military program within the civilian energy program. And during the 1950s and 60s, Sweden made substantial investments in this dual-use nuclear program. So as early as the mid-1950s, the Defense Research Agency concluded that it was, in fact, technically feasible for Sweden to produce nuclear weapons, given then the access to plutonium. And different weapons carrier systems were discussed, and Sweden had a strongly developed aircraft that was supposed to carry these weapons. The Swedish nuclear weapons program that was initiated in the 1940s became able to produce nuclear weapons by the mid-1950s. However, the program was secret in the initial years, which means that the public didn't know about it. But in 1954, the Supreme Commander proposed publicly that Sweden should acquire technical nuclear weapons. So leading politicians within the Social Democratic Party, and the Social Democrats were in the government at the time, they sided with the liberals and conservatives to support the Supreme Commander's call for Swedish nuclear weapons. And the key argument here was that it was necessary for Sweden to possess nuclear weapons in order to be able to defend the neutrality policy. Sweden was not a member of NATO. Instead, it was aiming to be neutral by the non-aligned policy. And to understand why these politicians, why the military establishment wanted to acquire nuclear weapons, we have to think about the neutrality policy. Because in order to keep that policy intact, it was considered necessary to have the strongest weapons available. So it was considered absolutely necessary to acquire nuclear weapons. There were those that wanted nuclear weapons, the military establishment, parts of the Social Democratic government, liberals and conservatives in parliament. But there was also strong opposition, especially after 1954, when the Supreme Commander called for Swedish nuclear weapons acquisition. Interestingly, there were fractions of the Social Democrats that strongly opposed nuclear weapons. For example, the women's branch of the Social Democrats, the Social Democratic Women's Organization, and its chairperson Inga Thorsson, they're often described as the leading light of anti-nuclear activities in Sweden at the time. But labor unions, churches, other organizations and peace groups also opposed nuclear weapons acquisition in Sweden. And they made very different arguments against nuclear weapons acquisition.
My name is Thomas Jonter. I'm Professor of International Relations at the Alva Myrdal Center for Nuclear Disarmament at Uppsala University. So I'm doing research on nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, and a little bit of energy security as well. And I'm trained as an historian, even though I'm a professor of international relations. Of course, the arch enemy at the time was Soviet Union. And before Soviet Union existed, it's always been Russia who has been a threat to Sweden. That was the main reason. But you can also argue this new technology, the nuclear technology, was a new field that the scientific community was very interested in Sweden. And also the newly established government, the Social Democratic government that was headed by Prime Minister Tage Erlander, who in fact had studied physics and was very interested in this new nuclear technology. It was explained, especially by the Swedish military, that Sweden must have or need to have a nuclear weapon capability to defend our neutral position. But of course, in the end, it was all about Soviet Union.
Sweden took concrete steps toward building a nuclear weapons capability.
The Swedish case is very interesting in that sense because it was not just about thinking or planning. In fact, in the end of 1940s, when the decision was made that Sweden should develop a nuclear power program, the idea was to place the military program in the civilian program. As long as the civilian capability to produce electricity using reactors, the capability to produce nuclear weapons would at the same time increase. And the research in earnest was initiated in the end of 1940s. But in the beginning of 1960s, when the Swedish government, backed by the majority of opposition parties, decided that Sweden should, instead of producing nuclear weapons, pursue a disarmament policy. At that time, around 1962-63, Sweden had set up a uranium factory, built one reactor to be used for a nuclear weapon production of plutonium of weapons-grade quality. And in 1968, the second reactor, that reactor did not go critical because then the whole debate had changed and Sweden had abandoned the plans to produce nuclear weapons. Sweden had everything in place to produce nuclear weapons. There were only two ingredients missing, and that was a reprocessing facility that was planned to be built but was never built. The weapons carrier system was not completely solved, so there were some technical reasons, even though the idea was to load the nuclear weapons in missiles, and the Swedish produce air fighters, the Dragon and the Lance should be used as weapon carrier system, but the technical arrangements was not completely solved. Otherwise, everything was in place. And in fact, in the mid-1950s, I argue in my book, The Key to Nuclear Restraint, that in 1955, Sweden reached the concept we call nuclear latency, meaning Sweden knew exactly what to do, what was needed to produce nuclear weapons. A good case to compare the Swedish plans to produce nuclear weapons is Switzerland. And Switzerland also had advanced plans, but they didn't build reactors. They had some uranium resources, and of course a lot of research was done, but they didn't develop the nuclear infrastructure the way Sweden did. So in that sense, when Sweden abandoned the nuclear weapons plans in 1968, it meant that a lot of investments, financially, scientifically, politically, had to be abandoned as well.
The debate about Swedish nuclear weapons was probably most intense in the mid 1950s, but in 1958 there was a very important decision made to postpone the decision about nuclear weapons acquisition until the 1960s. And there were two main arguments for postponing this decision. First, there was actually no need to make a final decision at the time, as there was a need for additional knowledge about technological prerequisites for nuclear weapons production. But second, there was a lot of hope that some progress would be reached in ongoing international nuclear disarmament negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union. And Sweden didn't want to disrupt these talks or make them more complicated by deciding to produce nuclear weapons. So the decision was made to wait until the 1960s and see if there was any progress in disarmament negotiations at the international level. And I find this really important because in parallel with the Swedish nuclear weapons debate, Sweden actually started to pay increased attention to the negotiations on disarmament at the international scenery. And from the early 1960s, disarmament evolved into a key feature of Sweden's active foreign policy, which took form in the 60s. And Foreign Minister Östen Undén was a key figure in making this happen. Undén was one of the opponents of Swedish nuclear weapons. And already in 1961, he appointed Alva Myrdal, who was a very well-known Swedish social democrat politician and diplomat, to look into the possibility for developing a Swedish disarmament program. And Alva Myrdal became the first out of 3 official Swedish disarmament representatives in international negotiations. She was followed by Inga Thorsson, who was the leader of the Social Democrat women in the 50s, and then Maj-Britt Theorin later on. And I find this fascinating because in international disarmament negotiations, women rarely hold these positions. So it was quite odd, in a way, to appoint women to these prestigious positions as early as the 1960s. When Alva Myrdal first took the post as disarmament negotiator for Sweden, she wrote a draft about the establishment of a nuclear weapons free club. The suggestion was that the non-nuclear weapon states in the United Nations should form a nuclear weapon free club on a voluntary basis. And this became known as the Undén Plan because the foreign minister introduced it to the United Nations in 1961. And this was Sweden's first sincere initiative in disarmament negotiations. So what he did was that he proposed that states that did not have nuclear weapons, states like Sweden, should continue to abstain from developing them. He wanted to put pressure on the existing nuclear weapon states to negotiate especially a nuclear test ban treaty, which he thought was the first important step on the path towards complete nuclear disarmament. This plan was met with mixed reactions. It was strongly opposed by the United States and its allies in NATO, with some exceptions such as Denmark and Norway. So the Undén Plan was Sweden's first disarmament initiative, but the possibility to actually do something on disarmament was strengthened when Sweden was invited to join the 18 Nations Disarmament Committee in the early 60s as the only Western non-aligned state. In this capacity, the Swedish government became a very active part in negotiations of both the partial test ban treaty, the priority of the Swedish government at the time, but also of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT. And an interesting dimension of Swedish disarmament engagement in the 1960s is that it was interrelated in a way with the Swedish nuclear weapons plans. In various statements, both in Sweden but also at the international scenery, the Swedish decision on its own nuclear weapons was made contingent on progress in disarmament and the nuclear weapons program, and especially Sweden's capability to produce nuclear weapons, Sweden's technological capability, was assumed in a way to give Sweden a strong position in these negotiations. So the Swedish delegation took a very technological approach to disarmament, suggesting various technical solutions to things that stood in the way for the US and the USSR to actually reach unity in negotiations. One of the priorities of the Swedish government in disarmament negotiations in the 1960s was to have balanced undertakings between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon state. For example, Alva Myrdal and her disarmament delegation, they suggested a package deal solution composed of the non-proliferation treaty, of a comprehensive test ban treaty, and of a fissile material cutoff treaty. And those familiar with disarmament debates today know that this package deal is still being discussed and described as a step-by-step approach to reach disarmament. This was a key priority in the 60s. It has still not happened. But what's interesting is that Swedish disarmament policy was dependent on, or at least backed up with, the capability to produce nuclear weapons, because this is what gave Sweden technological know-how on these matters. One possible interpretation is that this was a militarized approach to disarmament, where nuclear weapons capability was positioned at the very center of disarmament advocacy. So the MPT was negotiated, but it didn't become the package deal that the Swedish government envisioned. It didn't have a comprehensive test ban treaty or a fissile material cutoff treaty to make it this package that was preferred. But when Article 6 on disarmament was introduced into the text, the Swedish government saw it was possible to sign the treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state. And by signing the MPT in 1968, the Swedish nuclear weapons debate ended, because this made Sweden into a non-nuclear weapons state.
When the Swedish parliament made the decision in 1968, all political parties stood behind the disarmament policy, even though some military argued that some kind of reserve option should be kept until we know that the treaty on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons will be successful. And that's the reason why DO's nuclear weapons program didn't stop in 1961 or 62. It continued, in fact, until the beginning of the 1970s, where from 1968 especially, when Swedish parliament made a decision that Sweden shouldn't have nuclear weapons, the research at the Swedish Military Research Agency was scaled down step by step. And in 1972, most of the research to produce nuclear weapons were abandoned at the Swedish Military Research Agency. The political debate in itself was the most important reason why Sweden abandoned the nuclear weapons plans. But also another reason existed, and that was the US policy. Because even though Swedish scientists dreamed about self-sufficiency in the nuclear field, it became obvious that was not possible to reach such a situation where all the reactor parts and all technology in the fuel cycle should be produced in Sweden. So it became clear, especially in the 1950s, the more Sweden got involved in those nuclear plants on the civilian side as well, not only on the military side, that Sweden needed to cooperate with other countries, especially the United States. And the United States was against Sweden to acquire nuclear weapons, even though they didn't say that to Swedish decision makers bluntly, but they could use the Swedish technical dependence on US nuclear technology. When Sweden requested to purchase certain technology from the United States, they negotiated from the mid-1950s, and step by step that technical dependence could be used by the United States to steer away the civilian program. It made it difficult for Sweden to use, especially the parts of the Swedish nuclear infrastructure where American parts were involved or used, so to speak. So that became very difficult for Sweden to keep this sufficient nuclear policy. In fact, it became impossible. Because of the US policy, it became technically difficult for Sweden to have this kind of dual use reactors running because of the dependence on American technology, which made it difficult to put the military program within the civilian nuclear program. And in the end, that created the conflict between the civilian goals to produce electricity as cheap as possible in Sweden with the other goal to produce nuclear weapons. And that became a very complicated problem to solve. So that's one way the US policy became at least successful to delaying the Swedish building up of the nuclear infrastructure.
Women played an important role in Sweden's decision to renounce its nuclear weapons program. Dr. Rosengren reflects on this legacy.
One interesting feature of the Swedish nuclear weapons debate concerns the role of women and the role of gender in this debate. One of the strongest advocates against Swedish nuclear weapons acquisition was the Social Democrat Women's Organization, led by chairperson Inga Thorsson. And this organization launched its first official statement against nuclear weapons at its Congress in 1956. This is the first time that the Social Democrat Women's Organization actually got involved in a defense policy issue, and these kind of issues had for long been considered the sphere of men. So it was a very radical step for the women's organization to actually start working on nuclear weapons at the time. We have to understand that this is the 1950s. There were other expectations on what women were able to do. In this setting, the position of the Social Democrat women and of chairperson Inga Thorsson caused quite strong reactions, to say the least. Inga Thorsson announced the position of the Social Democrat Women's Organization to the Social Democrat Party Board, and one board member then asked the women's organization to change their position and to do the right thing. He said that he didn't think that the position of the women's organization was that threatening because this time, as in so many other critical situations, he expected women to end up following the men. He said that there's no reason for the Social Democrats to have two different positions on the matter, and that the women were the ones who should change their position. Similar arguments were made in the parliament. So a conservative politician argued that in order to reach necessary efficiency, the Swedish defense has to acquire nuclear weapons to be equipped with tactical atomic bombs, as it was called at the time. And he described this as a military necessity that would not change by emotions, or what he called emotional thinking. And emotions were then very much associated with the opposition to nuclear weapons acquisition, but also with women. And this is interesting because emotions in this debate were actually everywhere. For example, fear was a very central component of the nuclear weapons debate. Those in favor of nuclear weapons acquisition, they were afraid of hostile behavior by enemies, and those against nuclear weapons, they were afraid of the consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. So fear was present on both sides. Still, emotions sticked to women's bodies more than to the bodies of men. So, referring to the arguments of anti nuclear activists as emotional thinking, conservatives held that the choice to acquire nuclear weapons was actually an example of rational thinking. A distinction was made between anti nuclear activism, humanitarian concerns, and emotions on the one hand, and then support for nuclear weapons and rationality and reason on the other. And this follows gendered assumptions about men and masculinity and women and femininity. At the same time, those against Swedish nuclear weapons acquisition actually made emotion a very central part of their argumentation. They said that it was necessary to include emotions when we talk about such serious matters as nuclear weapons. And Inga Thorsson, she also accused the military establishment of being emotionally guided. The Social Democrat Women's Organization was one of the strongest voices against nuclear weapons. When Sweden decided to sign the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state in 1968, they declared themselves as winners of the Swedish nuclear weapons debate.
Following Russia's attack on Ukraine, Sweden joined NATO, which changed its relationship with nuclear weapons.
So after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Sweden decided to apply for NATO membership. And this is puzzling in many ways. The policy and the non-aligned policy has been a very central feature of Swedish security policy during the Cold War, but it has also been a very central part of Swedish national identity. And when we think about national identity, we tend to think about national identity as sticky, as something that doesn't change overnight. But when it came to NATO in 2022, it did change overnight. And an interesting feature of the Swedish NATO debate was that critique was repeatedly directed at the assumed bad state of Swedish military protection capabilities. And the Swedish armed forces were very central in the neutrality policy during the Cold War. So neutrality was considered in need of backup from the armed forces, and they were then mandated to ensure that the neutrality policy would work. In the NATO debate, the armed forces were described as insufficient to have this mandate. But also the neutrality policy was represented as something shameful or as a myth that never existed. So the argument was that Sweden was never de facto neutral due to secret relations with the United States, and that Sweden had relied upon extended nuclear deterrence all along through this relationship with the United States. And this made it possible to argue that extended nuclear deterrence and being a member of NATO was in fact more of a historical continuity than a change. So similar to how the neutrality policy was conceptualized, Swedish historical disarmament ambitions were associated with hypocrisy. It was described as some beautiful speech made by social democrats when they were, in fact, seeking protection under what was called the US nuclear weapons umbrella. And since extended nuclear deterrence was perceived as long-term continuity, disarmament ambitions were easy to discredit. And this contributed to the naturalization of the nuclear weapons dimension of NATO membership in Sweden. But at the same time, nuclear disarmament engagement was described as a hypocritical myth in Sweden. But the government also maintained that nuclear disarmament remained a policy priority, regardless of NATO membership. When the conservative foreign minister Thomas Billström, for example, presented Sweden's foreign policy priorities after the approval of Sweden's NATO application, he said, and I quote, "Sweden stands behind NATO's strategic deterrence and will remain a strong voice for arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation." So Sweden supports strategic deterrence and remains a strong voice for arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. And we haven't seen that much action on nuclear disarmament issues in Sweden for some time now. So it will be really interesting to see how the government combines these two ambitions. How do you combine support for extended nuclear deterrence with disarmament advocacy?
And in terms of nuclear weapons, it became a very sensitive issue when the membership of NATO became an issue in the Swedish political debate. Nuclear weapons became a very sensitive topic. It was not touched upon much. Politicians, irrespective of political color, did not talk about nuclear weapons. But what they said when it was asked by journalists that both the Social Democratic government ministers at the time argued that yes, we will apply for NATO membership, but we will not host nuclear weapons on Swedish soil in peacetime and no foreign military bases on Swedish ground. And that was also the view from the more liberal conservative parties. So that became a mantra that was used, but not that often, because it was not so much discussed whatsoever. And the reason is, of course, that since 1968, it was taken for granted, irrespective if we had a liberal conservative government or a social democratic government, that the disarmament policy has been a successful policy. So when we joined NATO, you could say that we open up the kitchen door for nuclear weapons, even though it was never debated or discussed in a Swedish political context.
The episode concludes with the lessons our guests recommend we take from the Swedish case for disarmament and non-proliferation in the 21st century.
The main lesson we can learn from the Swedish case is that disarmament engagement can be associated with influence and with prestige. In the 1960s, when Swedish nuclear disarmament policy evolved, it was very much associated with national pride. But for that to happen, it has to be prioritized. So that requires sufficient resources. It requires political engagement and commitment by both the government, obviously, but also by society at large. And what's interesting about Sweden is that nuclear disarmament has received very strong popular support in Sweden, and Swedish civil society organizations have in many ways supported progressive advocacy by the government. Throughout the Cold War, there were strong links between peace organizations and the government in advocating for nuclear disarmament at the global level. This is a very necessary component for this policy advocacy to both be successful, but also to have legitimacy at the national level. There's one thing we can learn about gender. Feminist scholarship on nuclear weapons has tended to focus on nuclear weapon states. And in different ways, it has identified linkages between nuclear weapons possession and a certain form of nuclearized, militarized masculinity. And this predicts that disarmament becomes associated with emasculation or feminization. If nuclear weapons possession is associated with masculinity, then its opposite becomes associated with something else. But Sweden kind of disrupts these linkages. Sweden had a nuclear weapons program that was considered sufficient to produce nuclear weapons in the mid-1950s. There was strong popular support of nuclear weapons acquisition in Sweden, and Sweden had the financial resources to actually acquire nuclear weapons. But something changed. In the early 1960s, the Swedish government started to prioritize nuclear disarmament engagement and became one of the most active members of international nuclear disarmament negotiations. And in this work, the Swedish disarmament delegation made associations between disarmament and technological expertise. It created space for another kind of masculinity in international affairs, where disarmament does not become linked with femininity or demasculinization, rather the opposite.
There is at least two important lessons from the Swedish plans to produce nuclear weapons during the Cold War and why they were abandoned in the end. And one is that in a democratic state, and if political debate on the issue is allowed, which was the case not only in Sweden, also in Switzerland, the possibilities for a resistance to develop, to criticize, and to be successful are much, much greater and can be in a situation where they can hinder the military and in combination with the research community to position to produce nuclear weapons. Because if you compare with other two democratic states, France and United Kingdom, they also, of course, had nuclear weapons plans, but in the end, they produce nuclear weapons. And there are many reasons for that, not only technical and a lack of open political debate, but I think at least if you compare the Swedish and Swiss case with the cases of France and United Kingdom, in both those countries, the programs were not up for discussion. It was secretly held, and even though people knew about it, of course, but something that was allowed to be discussed, and they went for more or less a single-use nuclear weapons reactor program to produce nuclear weapons, a military program. So they didn't have to make compromises with civilian goals like Sweden had to do. In that sense, transparency is very important. A political debate can change a situation, at least in the case of Sweden. A second lesson has to do with the idea that the military program should be placed in a civilian program. That led to technical problems, time-consuming processes to make compromises between civilian goals and military goals. And that in itself had as a consequence, at least in the Swedish case, that actors like the United States, a country which Sweden collaborated very closely with, even though Sweden was a non-aligned country, and that led to a situation where the United States could influence how the civilian program was developed. That made it more difficult for a military program, meaning producing nuclear weapons, to be successful. You could compare the Swedish case with Iran, for example. Iran is a completely different country, of course, but they also started with a heavy water program to use natural uranium and then in the end produce plutonium. But they changed their mind. But that in itself was also in Iran a very time-consuming process. And international actors, other countries, the International Atomic Energy Agency could see what was going on, and then they could intervene in different ways. So I think that is very important to bear in mind, the technical solutions that are chosen by a country.
Thank you for listening, our guests for speaking, and the European Union Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium for funding this series. Until next time, stay optimistic.